I think we're just gonna get into it. Okay, so guys, this is the monthly Patreon opening lab. Once a month, what I do is I put up a post on our Patreon page and I ask folks to submit opening questions. This is specifically for the folks at the $15 tier and higher, because if we offered it to the lower tiers, it would just be too much. So this is kind of like an exclusive privilege we give to those that support us on Patreon at $15 a month. And we now do the show live, so even though only members can submit questions, everyone can learn from the questions submitted. So this month we have 4 questions. We got one at the very last second from Steve, which is totally fine. And I do apologize to those that were hoping to watch this on, I think it originally was scheduled for Saturday, but I had to postpone it because I just wasn't feeling well. But we're doing better now. And like I mentioned, we have 4 questions today. And so yeah, let's get into it. While I'm answering these questions, guys, of course, I won't be able to answer other questions from the chat, but if you have like a follow-up question or like a specific question, about what we're like looking at, that's of course okay. And especially if you're the person that actually asked the question and you have a follow-up question on your own, question, then that is totally acceptable as well. All right, so let's get into it. Our first question comes from Mitch, our own Mitch Fabian, one of our mods, commentators, and players. And Mitch asks, in the English, after c4, e5, g3, many authors recommend 2c6, somewhat entering a c3 Sicilian a tempo down. The Lapan is typically frowned upon for white, so why is it recommended for black? Is it just because black is looking for equality, or is 2g3 a waste for white in this structure? So actually this question and a few of our other questions have a kind of underlying opening question buried underneath the surface that I think is actually really important to address. So yeah, Mitch brings up a good question here. Generally, we often see this position with reverse colors. When white plays e4 and black responds with the Sicilian, one option for white is the c3 Sicilian, also known as the Lapan. And so first, let's clarify the reputation of this move. And I think opinions on this one vary, so I'm not just kind of giving my subjective opinion here, but this is kind of how I feel people see this one. This is a Sicilian sideline. The main line in the Sicilian is for white to go for the open Sicilian with knight f3 and d4. The drawbacks of the open Sicilian is that it definitely leads to sharper positions. In terms of theory, white kind of has to be aware of more ideas, whereas when you choose a sideline, you generally kind of have less work to look at in the opening, and you can kind of narrow down the types of positions you're going to get. Because when white plays c3 here, basic idea is to play d4 and recapture in the center with the pawn, build kind of like this nice pawn center, and it kind of narrows down the options that black has. So there are lots of Sicilian sidelines. There's the c3 Sicilian, which I would say is one of the absolute most popular lines that white can choose from. There's also lines starting with knight c3 that usually lead into the Grand Prix attack with f4, or the closed Sicilian with g3. Thank you, not sure for the prime sub, much appreciated. Now the c3 Sicilian, I would say, is definitely, it's not an unambitious opening. At the highest levels, it is considered somewhat unambitious because black's path to equality is generally going to be pretty straightforward, whereas in the open Sicilian, this is just like a very heavy battleground, and if black wants to equalize here, they do have to know what they're doing, and they have to be really precise with their prep, especially when they're when you're going up against elite GM. So at the highest levels, this one is not considered to be so dangerous for black, but that's mainly because these guys at the top level, they know everything, right? And so when you know everything in the opening, then it's like, yeah, if there's a clear path to equality, and the way the theory stands now, both d5 here, queen takes d5, and the move knight f6, which I personally prefer, provoking white to advance e5 so that black can take this square. Both of these moves are considered to be equalizing. There are also, other lines here. There's like e6, but this one I am not such a fan of for black because you basically get a French type of position, and if white wants to, they can even transpose into the advanced French. And if you're not a French player, then you're not exactly going to want this from black's point of view, even though objectively it's totally fine. Okay, so that said, at lower levels, this c3 Sicilian, I think, still poses some challenges for black, right? Especially if black is not super familiar with what to do. The c3 Sicilian can definitely pose some problems. So for example, in these lines after knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4, takes, for example, generally black is going to be castling kingside, and this does give white some attacking chances, like bishop comes to d3. This e5 pawn prevents black from having a knight on f6, and that means that one day the h7 pawn is kind of a target, and white tries to get some real attacking chances on the king side. In compensation for this, black gets very easy counterplay against this advanced e5 pawn. So generally black will go e6 here and d6, put pressure on this pawn, knight can come out to c6 or to d7, and one day white can be left with a weak e5 pawn. And so this is why the c3 Sicilian, as you go higher and higher, is generally less and less liked by strong players. Now, don't get me wrong, guys. There's lots of grandmasters to this day that still play the c3 Sicilian, but they have kind of like years of experience, and they're okay with taking on the risk. So what risk exactly is white taking on? Well, white is risking to have a weak structure in the future. And that's the case in this line. You can end up with a weak pawn on e5. It's also the case in the d5 lines, where typically here, after takes, queen takes d5 and d4, one day black is going to take on d4 and leave white with an isolated queen pawn. It's not considered accurate to do it right away because you give white the c3 square and the knight can come out with tempo, but one day black will take on d4, most likely after, let's say, developing the knights, and white will be left with an isolated queen pawn. Now, can you play with an isolated queen pawn? Of course, the positions are 100% playable for white. And again, if white is a well-prepared player and they have experience in these positions, they can definitely pose some real problems for black. But at the highest levels, where black kind of like knows everything and knows exactly how to equalize, in general, people don't want to accept an isolated queen pawn because it's kind of this like long-term strategic weakness, and it puts the onus on white to create some initiative to kind of justify for this kind of strategic deficit in their position. Excuse me, guys, I gotta check one thing. Okay, so long story short, at the highest levels, people don't really want to take on this weakness, and they feel like knight f3 is more of a challenging attempt, going for the open Sicilian. But at lower levels, I would say the c3 Sicilian is fully playable. Personally, I don't recommend it to my students because I don't really want them playing with the isolated queen pawn or with this weak e5 pawn. I generally recommend just to go for knight f3 lines right from the start, get comfortable jumping right into the fire, like if you're going to be an e4 player, and get more experience in these sharp open positions. There is a question about the Rossolimo and the Moscow variations. You know, personally, I don't even consider these to be Sicilian sideline. I would say against knight c6 in this position, nowadays you see d4 and bishop b5 pretty much 50-50, I would say, at grandmaster level. You know, Fabiano used this one several times against Magnus in their World Championship match before switching to d4. So I would say bishop b5 is just considered a very serious main line. And against d6, bishop b5 check, I would say this one is just considered a very serious line as well. So I wouldn't think it's fully justified to call these a sideline anymore, because lots of players go in for this one, and definitely these moves pose some problems for black also. Okay, so getting back to the question, and this is a pretty typical question, like if, you know, like what happens when you play the reverse of an opening? So the question was about the English, you know, c4, e5, g3, c6. And the question was like, well, if this line, when white plays it, is considered, let's say somewhat second rate, then how could black play it down a tempo? Isn't black just going to be in trouble? So the answer to that is it's important to remember that white and black are playing for different things in the opening. Generally, white is trying to fight for an advantage, and if white equalizes out of the opening or only gets an equal position, that means that black kind of won the opening battle, right? Black is trying to equalize, white is the one trying to fight for an advantage. So just because the c3 Sicilian doesn't guarantee white any advantage when you play it as white, does not mean that it's going to be a bad opening for black, because black is just trying to equalize. Black is not trying to prove an advantage. And the extra tempo, I would say, often is not important, or at least not, it's kind of like negligible. It's definitely important. It's nice to have an extra tempo in the position, but if we compare the two positions, the extra tempo in this case is this move g3, right? It's the exact same position, except white gets this move g3. I guess corresponding position would be here if black was able to get the free move g6. And I would say that this move doesn't change things too much. In some cases, it can definitely be helpful. I mean, for example, in this line, after takes, and d4, one of black's options is actually just to play g6 here. And this one is playable. It's not the main move, but it is very playable. So if we look at the reverse position, let's say c4, e5, g3, c6, here, as you can imagine, one of white's main moves is d4. And now if black takes and white goes queen takes d4, well, then I would say this is kind of like a small win for white, because basically you're getting that position that's already considered kind of fine for black. Here you have it with an extra tempo, and the position is somewhat more open, right? So compared to other lines, which means that the extra tempo is probably going to be more valuable. This is like a general rule of thumb, right? The more open a position is, the more pawns that have been traded, the more open lines you have, the higher the value of a single tempo. Whereas if you compare it to something like a King's Indian or a French, where like everything gets blocked up, sometimes an extra tempo means very, very little, because it's a closed position and there's not so much you can do with it. So basically, to answer the general question, it's because people have different goals in the opening. Black is trying to equalize, white is trying to fight for an advantage. I mean, you can say the English is kind of like a reverse Sicilian on its own, like you're playing a reverse dragon. The dragon, or the accelerated dragon, usually is enough to equalize for black, but with white with an extra tempo, it's not necessarily enough for an advantage. Although, of course, the English is one of the, most ambitious, not most ambitious, but it's one of the main openings that white can play, and lots of top players play c4 and try to fight for a real opening edge. What do I mean by tempo? Basically, tempo means a move. If you have like an extra tempo in the position, it means you get an extra move, which is very useful because it means you have an extra move to like develop your pieces and improve your position. There are many closed French and King's Indian positions where one tempo means everything. Yeah, of course. That's why I said as a general rule. Of course, there are lots of exceptions. I mean, in the King's Indian specifically, it's because both sides are attacking on opposite sides of the board, and it's not so much the fact that the position is closed, it's the fact that it's like an opposite sides castling position. Although usually in the King's Indian, we're castled on the same side. But the point is that white is attacking on the queen side, black is attacking on the king side, and then the value of one tempo is very important. But I'm saying generally in open positions, giving your opponent an extra tempo is going to be dangerous. If the c4 is reverse Sicilian, can it be aggressive as a Sicilian? Can it be as aggressive as a Sicilian but as white? So this is kind of like a paradox. It's kind of funny. Like the Sicilian for black is considered one of the most sharpest and dynamic openings, but the English for white is actually considered to be pretty positional. The reason for that goes back, in my opinion, again to goals, right? White is fighting for an advantage, so when white is facing the Sicilian, generally they're playing aggressively and they're opening the center, and so that means the game is going to be sharp. But against the English, black is not going to be just doing the same thing that white does, right, in the open Sicilian. Instead, black is just going to be choosing a solid setup and just trying to equalize, and generally after c4, things take on more of a positional nature. As they do in the Sicilian, by the way. There are many positions in the Sicilian where the game is just very strategic, very positional, and we wouldn't consider it like super dynamic or tactical, right? Sicilian is a very, very, wide range of openings, and you can get all kinds of positions. Let me kind of wrap up some loose ends here. And thanks, Jaxer, for the gifted sub. Much appreciated. What do I mean by opening advantage? If one side has an advantage, is the game a win or still a draw with the best play? No, I mean, definitely I'm not trying to... it's not like a table-based evaluation. What I mean by advantage is someone is better, right? There can be different kinds of advantages. Having an extra pawn is an advantage. Having more space can be an advantage. Having more active pieces can be an advantage. Having a healthier structure, you don't have as many weaknesses, can be an advantage. Having the safer king can be an advantage. And so, the advantage can range from very, very small to decisive, right? So decisive advantage, that usually means that the game is pretty much winning, or very, very likely winning, as long as both sides continue with good moves, right? It doesn't even have to be best play, but continue reasonably. So let's go back. So actually in this line, after c4, e5, g3, c6, I believe the main move here, or one of the main moves, is d4. White can also play knight f3 here, which is similar to when black plays knight f6 against the Alapin. And then after e4, knight d4, and d5, basically get very similar positions that arise out of that opening. With one exception, actually, and I thought this one was kind of interesting. Here, when white goes c takes d5, black is usually taking back with the queen, which is not the main way that the c3 side does it when white is playing the c3 Sicilian. I'm sorry if anyone's getting dizzy from all the transpositions, but I did think this was interesting. So if we play the corresponding line, e5, knight d5, d4. So here, notice black does not have this move g6. After c d4, usually white is taking with the pawn here. Queen takes d4 is possible, but it's considered to be a little bit, I would say, a little bit dubious compared to c takes d4. Here, the knight can come out to c6 and gain a tempo on the queen. And the difference here is that, why white doesn't play this one, but black will play it in the corresponding position, is that here it's as if black has this extra move g6, which I would say is actually not helpful for black. If anything, it's harmful. And the reason is, after knight f3, let's say, knight c6, queen e4, black's main move here is f5. And if white takes on f6, knight takes f6, and queen h4, with the pawn on g7 here, I would say black is better in this position, because black is going to play e5 and d5 and take the center. But with the pawn on g6, which would basically be the same position if we started with the English as white and kind of did the reverse thing again, it's actually a worse version for black, because the knight on f6 is weaker, bishop g5 is more of a threat, and it's kind of annoying and, yeah, basically an unnecessary weakness. So that's maybe one kind of very concrete difference between the two variations, that in this position after d5 takes, queen takes d5 is actually a lot more playable, because again, if white was to do this, kind of doesn't really feel so good to play both e3 and g3 in this position, and in my opinion, I think it would actually be better for white to put the pawn back on g2. Yeah, no worries, Steve, not at all. Okay, so Yeah, just to answer the question once again, it is because black is looking for equality mainly, but in some cases this g3 move is actually not useful for white, and it's actually kind of an unnecessary weakness, and this is the main reason here. I should also note that when white goes d4 in this position, the main choice for black is not to take, where I do think white gets kind of the more comfortable game, and the extra tempo matters here a little bit more. Instead, in this position, black usually plays e4. And when we look at the reverse position once again, let's say c3, d5, white almost never plays e5 here because it's considered that black can just equalize very easily with knight c6, bishop f5, and so on. The bishop gets out, you get like a very nice type of French position, but black is equalizing here. It doesn't mean that black is better, right, with an extra tempo, right? Sometimes an extra tempo is helpful, sometimes it means the position is just still equal. So when white again starts with this one and gets this extra move g3, I would say in this position this extra move is really not worth that much. White is still totally fine, and you still get, you know, your kind of reverse French, but I would say black is also fine in this position. Okay. I think that's gonna wrap it up on this question. Let me quickly move on to the next one. And yeah, next question is from Joe B. Let me size it up here right cleanly. Okay, there we go. Joe B is asking, in the d3 Rui, what's the issue if black plays 5b5, bishop b3, and d5? I don't see any issues after e takes d5, knight takes d5, but the engine gives a nearly +1. Okay, so interesting question, and off the top of my head, I can't say I really knew the answer to this one. I definitely did some research here, and it also brings up an interesting question as to what to do when the engine gives you some kind of evaluation that you don't fully understand. The engine is saying +1, big advantage, but you don't quite get why it's +1. So what should you do in this case? So let's put the position on the board. 5d3, black plays b5 because now this e4 pawn is defended, so white is starting to take and then take on e5. Unless, just to note, bishop c5 is played, then you have to be careful and not fall into this trick, which could just be game over. I think white still survives, like with bishop e3, but the point is be careful about queen d4. So usually once white defends the e-pawn, black is pushing b5. And now the question was, why is d5 considered so bad for black according to the engine? So generally speaking, and this was just, if I had to answer this question without doing any research, I would say the reason d5 here is maybe a little bit early, the reason d5 can be a risky move in these positions, it's because the e5 pawn can become a target. And after looking at it a little bit, I would say that is pretty much the case here. So I think white's best move is to castle, and then immediately put a rook onto e1, and just take aim at this e5 pawn. And it seems like black is just not in time to really defend this one comfortably. So bishop d6, we have to note, is not possible, right? Knight on d5 is hanging. Queen d6 is going to be awkward. You don't want to block the bishop. And so after bishop e7, rook to e1, black doesn't really have such a great move here. f6 is possible sometimes, but it's pretty weakening, especially with this bishop sitting on this diagonal. And the move like bishop f6 is going to run into d4. So this d4 move, since black's king is still in the center, is very annoying, and basically black just doesn't have a good way of defending this pawn. Right now white is starting to take, and then this knight is going to be hanging. Similarly, after f6, I think white has a couple of good moves here. d4 is again very much worth considering, just to open up the position. And if black is, you know, trading like this and taking, it's just a lot of weaknesses here in black's position, and white just has a huge advantage. Now, from a human point of view, white has a very nice initiative. The engine is a calculator, right? So it's already calculated it out, and it already sees that white is like winning material way into the future. That's why the engine is saying +1, but it's not necessarily useful to to know the evaluation. I think the human evaluation in this case is actually a lot more useful. Whether the engine says it's +1 or +2, +3, it's like, the point is you have the initiative and you have to attack. And if you find the right attacking moves, you'll get a good position. And if not, then black will be able to equalize, right? The engine, of course, just sees the solution immediately, but as a human, it's understand where your advantage is coming from. And here it's because white just has big initiative and black has tons and tons of weaknesses. Okay, so now let me ask, or let me answer the more general question here. Which is, what should you do when like the engine gives you an evaluation that you don't fully understand? My suggestion would be in these cases would be to spar against the engine. So what do I mean by spar? I mean, you let the engine play white, right? The engine is the one making the claim. Stockfish thinks this position is +1, and I checked it with my own Stockfish, and I can confirm Stockfish, thinks it's +1, running on a reasonably strong machine. But then you take black, right? So if you don't really believe it, if you think, why is this so bad for black? Let me try to defend it. You make natural moves for black, and then you let the engine play white, or you just input its suggestions. And, usually the engine will kind of crush you or show you what the problem is. And as you kind of do this analysis, this back and forth, that's when you'll pick up ideas. So in general, I think this is how you should be using the engine if you're going to be using it. The eval alone is not very helpful, right? For most of us, if I just give you some random position and I tell you the engine evaluation, maybe that's a useful hint, but it's not going to tell you how to actually play the position, how to exploit the advantage, how to maximize it, etc. The only way to actually figure that out is to go in and analyze some lines and actually spar with the engine. And I found some interesting lines here that I'll share with you guys. One move I also checked was bishop c5, just because I thought, okay, it's an active move, and I wanted to see what white should do here. And the interesting thing is that against bishop c5, this is kind of like a tricky one. If white was to play, let's say, in the same manner with rook to e1, then after castles, knight takes e5, black actually can create some annoying counterplay with this move queen h4, right? Hitting f2, and yeah, I mean, I analyzed it a little bit here. I mean, the knight on c6 is hanging, but basically it's kind of dangerous for white here. I mean, this knight on d5, black is basically hanging two pieces here. So I analyzed it a little bit more. But basically it's very dangerous. For example, bishop takes d5, black takes here, and then if rook takes e5, there's bishop takes f2 check, king h1, bishop g4, and it's risky. White is not having fun in this position. So what should white do instead? So the engine actually comes up with a couple of interesting ideas. A simple solution here is this move knight takes e5, which is a very thematic idea when black puts the bishop on c5. And the point here is that you snap on e5, knight takes e5, and then you push d4, winning the piece back with a very open position. And here it's like white is kind of ahead in time. The king is already castled. Black owes us a tempo to castle, and the position is opening up, right? So this is just very dangerous. Bishop d6, again, black has to be super careful here because taking and this knight is just hanging. So here I would say white is better. If bishop g4, white can just play f3, and now black has three pieces hanging, so white will win the piece back with a nice position. Another interesting line I found is that white can try this move knight c3, which at first glance I would say is pretty counterintuitive. We allow black to trade off this kind of target on d5 and double our pawns in the process. But the point is that white can actually create some real initiative with this idea of playing knight g5 and queen h5. And just for example, let's say black castles, white goes knight to g5. This can be very risky. So one cool line I found here, let's say black plays queen e7. The threat was to go queen to h5. White goes queen h5 anyway, h6, knight e4. And if black drops back here with the move bishop to b6 I was looking at, white has this really cool resource, bishop to g5. So this is the one I wanted to show because I think it's a very nice attacking idea. You don't really see this one every day, although I would say it is kind of thematic. The point is, if the queen moves away, white is going to sack on h6 and give checkmate, like for example here, takes, and there's knight f6 check coming. And if black takes, then knight takes g5. White just has a crushing attack with queen h7 just being a devastating threat. I'm noticing now that black has the move bishop to f5. And I didn't check this one with the engine, but let me see. Feels like maybe bishop d5 and white can win back a lot of material. But this is an example of how you can make mistakes in your analysis where, you know, the engine says it's winning and then you don't check like the most obvious move. So what is the solution on bishop d5, bishop f5? Let me confirm this one so I don't give you guys any. Oh no, excuse me, g4. Oh, of course, g4 is the refutation because there's no bishop g6, queen takes g6. I'm very glad we noticed this one. Bishop g6, queen takes. It brings up an important point, guys. When you're analyzing with the engine, don't forget to turn off your own brain. Because earlier I was looking at it and just looking at the engine, not using my own brain. As soon as I saw this position in front of me for real, I was like, wait, bishop f5? But now we understand. Bishop f5, g4, and it's GG. So that is how you analyze with the engine. You spar with it. You don't forget to incorporate your own ideas, and then the engine can show you some really, really instructive resources. Okay, now the position is like +8 because black is essentially just losing this and is going to have to give up a lot of material to avoid getting checkmated. So yeah, of course, these lines aren't forced by any means, but I thought this is maybe, you know, just kind of an interesting example of how this very direct brute force knight g5, queen h5 thing can be very, very strong in these kinds of positions, especially when your bishop on b3 is more or less uncontested. Okay, so long story short, black does want to play d5 in the Rui in the middle game, but if you do it too early, of course the e5 pawn ends up hinging. And just as a total, not a total tangent, but kind of like as an interesting point, if we take a look at the Marshall attack, one of the sharpest positions in the Ruy Lopez, where black does play d5. The reason this one kind of works for black is because white's last move was c3, which really slows down white's development and takes away the c3 square from the knight. So because white's development here is so slow, this kind of gives black a, you know, justification of actually sacrificing this pawn, playing c6, bishop d6, and of course going for the famous Marshall attack, where it's, you know, I mean, it's been analyzed to death and everyone agrees black has, you know, full compensation for the pawn. So once you're castled and white has kind of committed to c3, you know, blocking in some of his own pieces, or their own pieces, excuse me, then the d5 break ends up a lot more satisfactory. Hey, thanks Dr. Chainsaw for the sub. Got a bronze in a tournament out of 1,100 people. Wow, bronze? That sounds like third place. Nice, nice. Very cool, very cool. Well, yeah, you can share the bronze medal with all of us. That's that's great. Okay, Joe B, hopefully that answers the question. And yeah, let's just keep it going. Move on to the next one here, which comes from Ian, longtime supporter. Shout out to Ian. And actually pretty simple question from Ian this time. How should black meet 1b4 in ChessDojo's view? Ian, guys, actually, I believe has asked the question in like almost every opening lab I've done. And this is a show that I've been doing before ChessDojo was like even a thing, right? This used to be my personal Patreon page. This was a thing I was doing for patrons for now running on, I want to say 2-3 years. So at this point, Ian has asked me about almost every line he can think of. Okay, so now we're getting into the real sidelines. How should black meet b4? So this is known as the orangutan. I think it's also called the Polish opening. Recently, Magnus played this one in the online rapid events, the Champion Chess Tour. a couple times, maybe as somewhat of a troll, I'm not really sure. I would say, in general, you don't really have to worry about this one too much, and I would recommend just playing whatever you normally play against d4. So if you're like a Queen's Gambit decline player, then against b4, just go ahead and play d5, e6, knight f6, bishop e7. You can stick to your normal setup and you're absolutely fine. If you're a King's Indian player, you can play knight f6 here and g6, and you can go for this setup. And again, if you're a King's Indian player or a Grunfeld player, this is absolutely fine. Bishop takes f6, I think, is not really anything to worry about. Yeah, sure, our structure gets a little bit weakened, but in compensation, you get a very strong dark through bishop here. So generally, this one is totally okay. Other good setups here include, like, I think, personally, I feel like if you don't have to play e6 and block in your bishop, then you can definitely try to exploit that and try to get the bishop out of the pawn chain. Usually here, white plays something like knight f3 or e3, and I would say it's totally fine for black to play like bishop f5 here, for example. Bishop g4, I think, is also good, followed by e6, bishop e7. And yeah, basically, I don't think black experiences any real issues here. And honestly, I don't think this one is really worth studying beyond like 3-4 moves, just kind of thinking about your general setup. It's very rare and objectively doesn't promise white any advantage. In fact, the engine often just thinks black is better after this move and gives the move e5. As a kind of a fun note, apparently, the whole point of the openings there, you're going bishop to b2, and like, you're kind of letting black take this pawn on b4 because the bishop on b2 has targets. But actually, you can 100% take this one and play knight f6 and castle and go d5, and you have very quick development. And I would say this position is also considered completely fine for black. And if I had to choose, I would already prefer to be black in this position. So multiple options here. If you really want to refute the opening, you can, or let's say try to get an advantage with black, or play the most ambitious thing, you can just play for e5 and look into this one. So hopefully that makes sense. Thanks Mitch for the bits. Yeah, normally you wouldn't want to trade a central pawn for the wing pawn, but this is one of the exceptions. That's absolutely right. Because I think black just gets a very nice lead in development, and then the open e file ends up being pretty useful. So in this case, you can totally do it. Okay. Yeah, hopefully that settles that. Basically, it's not really worth worrying about, and there's like 5 or 6 different setups that are completely acceptable. Yeah, even c6 is a move followed by a5, which is kind of a funny thing to do, but this one is actually totally playable for black, just not letting white advance b5 and immediately putting pressure on this pawn. Okay, let's keep things moving. We have one more question from Steve. And Steve is asking, would appreciate advice on refuting the English attack when playing the Najdorf. So yeah, I think there is an important question kind of buried in this one that I want to address. And that is, what does it mean to refute an opening? So yeah, we got to be really careful with the language here. I would say the word refutation is actually a very strong word and should be treated very, very carefully. So simply put, you're not going to refute the English attack. There is no refutation. Refutation is when you just totally kill a line and you make it just unplayable. So for example, e4, e5, knight f3, f6. This move is basically refuted by knight takes e5. In case people aren't aware, this is just a very strong sacrifice that just kills it. I mean, obviously f6 is not a great move for many reasons. d4, white gets huge advantage. Bishop c4, white gets a huge advantage, etc. But this is the quote-unquote refutation, because after f e5, queen h5 check, let's say king e7 takes here, bishop c4 check, king g6, queen f5 check, king h6. The king just gets mated here. So it's just GG, like G5, H4. This has been long known, hundreds of years. I think Greco was the first one, or one of the first to play this kind of game. And yeah, basically black is getting mated and totally lost, completely unplayable, completely unplayable. So yeah, I understand. No, but that's why I think it's kind of an important lesson, because people are often you know, confused about what a lot of these like random chess terms mean. When it comes to a mainline opening, such as the English attack, you know, of the Najdorf and other main lines, you're not going to find a refutation. Best thing you're going to get is an equal game, right? So black is generally fighting for equality. If white plays like some, you know, crazy stuff, then yeah, those lines can be refuted. But yeah, for all the main stuff, what we're striving for from the opening is equal play. Either an equal position, you know, strategically, you have no weaknesses, you're not behind in development, your opponent has no advantage, or an equal position dynamically, meaning it's not like a symmetrical position. I would say this is like, you know, one of the most asymmetrical positions we can have in chess, but black's dynamic play is definitely satisfactory, where black can fight with equal chances. Okay, so Steve said, please just tell me how not to get crushed. Yeah, absolutely. So there are many different things black can do here. And if I'm not mistaken, Steve, you're not a fan of this move e5. You're generally playing the move e6. Correct me if I'm wrong. Both of these moves are considered 100% main lines. I would say at the highest level, e5 is, I think nowadays, considered the more solid choice, with e6 being kind of the riskier one. But many players don't like playing e5 in this kind of position, because you do give up the d5 square, and you really have to know how to play against that. So again, let's make this clear. e5 is 100% a good move for black and 100% playable. In fact, this is what is considered the main line at the highest levels. It's like slightly more popular than e6, but it's not everyone's cup of tea. And so a lot of players prefer to play Scheveningen structure with e6 and d6, where black doesn't give up the d5 square at the cost of not fighting for as much space and allowing white's knight to stay active in the center. Okay, so Steve wants to play a setup with e6. That's absolutely fine. Generally, white here is playing some mix of f3, queen d2, castling queenside, and then pushing g4, h4, h5 on the king side. Definitely very, very reasonable approach for white, and very dangerous. Okay, so a couple of disclaimers. I'm not a Najdorf expert. I've never played the Najdorf in any serious games. I've studied a lot of Najdorf positions. I've studied it from white's point of view, but from black's point of view, my experience here is very, very little. I've played some similar setups, like the Taimanov Sicilian can often lead to similar structures. But basically, I would just like to preface this with saying, like, I'm not a Najdorf expert, so if I say something inaccurate, I do apologize, and hopefully YouTube can correct me later. Now, Steve is asking, would I suggest to learn how to play the e5 line? Not necessarily, no. I think both setups are absolutely playable, and I think it's just a matter of taste. One day it will probably be good for your chess education to kind of learn how to play these structures as well, because certainly I can guarantee you, you do get compensation for this square, and you can fight against it. But I think the e6 positions are very, very interesting, and honestly, I mean, I would, like, if my student was playing the Najdorf and they asked, like, what should I play, e6 or e5? I would actually say go for the e6 stuff. I think it's kind of more interesting for black. E5 lines can actually get a little bit more positional. Okay, so what to actually do in this setup? Generally, players are going to be starting with b5 here, and the general setup is to put the bishop on b7. And eventually, this knight goes to d7, and then b6, and then this knight can drop back to d7. So it's kind of a funny thing. Like, for example, let's say queen d2, bishop b7, castles, knight d7, white goes g4. And here it's kind of important for black to vacate the d7 square, so that if white is pushing g5, your second knight can use this square, and then this knight can come to e5, and both of these knights are fighting for the c4 square, followed by rook c8 and so on. And in general, I think black gets really decent counterplay here. The idea is to play rook to c8 and either knight e5 followed by using the c4 square, or second idea for black is to push b4, kick white's knight away from the center, and then push d5. So just for example, let's say white plays h4, rook c8, let's just say king b1, some move. Already here, I would say it's possible for black to push b4, kicking the knight to e2, and then playing d5. And this is one of those weird things where it's like your king is in the center and black is playing d5. Well, the Najdorf is a very risky opening, and this is why. Because in some positions, in many positions, you have to play with the king in the center. Because if you castle too quickly in the Najdorf, a lot of times you're kind of walking into white's attack, right? So that can be very dangerous. So what many Najdorf players do is they develop their queenside play first, and only one day they castle once everything is developed and they're ready to fight back. So this d5 break, this is a very important idea for black in this position because you're opening up your bishop on the long diagonal. Against this f3, e4 chain, we're kind of restricted here, but against d5, now we're opening everything up. White cannot push e5 because we have this one under control. And then if white takes, I think you can take with the bishop here or maybe with the knight. I'm not really sure about this exact position. But basically, this is a very nice pawn break for black, and you get lots of counterplay on the queen side. So this is one way of generating counterplay in the position. What I would also like to note, which is kind of funny, let's say white plays a very early move g4. Let's say queen d2, bishop b7, and now white plays g4, with the idea that if you go knight d7 here, they're going to go g5, right? And then your knight here doesn't have a great square. You got to go knight h5, which is not always ideal. We're back to g8, which is pretty bad. So what many players do, if white goes for an early g4, is they play knight f d7. And the point of this one is you're going to bring this knight to b6 and then the other knight to d7. So like a little switcheroo, but it's basically the same tempo and you're not losing time, right? So either this knight takes 2 moves to get to b6 and this knight takes 1 move to get to d7, or this knight takes 2 moves to get to b6 and the other knight takes 1 move to get to d7. So this is kind of a nice little idea to keep in mind. And then white is usually advancing g5 or castling, and basically black's setup is the same. So knight comes out to d7. You generally don't want to play knight c6 in this position. You want these knights on e5 and fighting for the c4 square. Yeah, I think Kasparov was definitely a big fan of these types of things, but not just him. Of course, lots of Najdorf players as well. Okay, so this is kind of like the classic way in these e6 positions that black is trying to get counterplay. Now we're running very short on time, guys, so I just want to finish up with this one thing. What I would suggest for you, Steve, as an additional option, if you want to kind of throw your opponent off balance, very interesting idea in this position, as soon as white plays f3, is to actually meet them with h5. And the point hopefully is pretty obvious. You're just stopping g4. Now this move is fully playable. It's not considered as solid as, let's say, the other lines, but none of these lines are really solid. This is just a very sharp position. But this move has been played by tons and tons of super GMs. So this is not just like a random, trick. Like this has been played by Magnus, Anish Giri, Grischuk, lots and lots of Najdorf players. And I think this is a very interesting choice, let's say at, club level, because MVL, I'm sure, has played this one as well. So yeah, this is like a very respected line. I think it's a really interesting choice because a lot of English attack players are just not going to know what to do, right? They have one plan in this position, and that's to go g4, and now you're just stopping it. So I would say this one is very much worth trying. I think the positions are really interesting. And from here, your setup is the exact same. b5, bishop b7, knight d7, rook c8, etc. So what usually is going to happen is white will make all of their other moves that they normally make, and then we're going to get here, and maybe they'll go king b1, right? And then you can play knight d7. And basically your opponent's not going to know what to do because they can't go g4, if they play h3, you're going to shut them down with h4 and not let them advance, right, because of en passant. And so this is actually just a tough position. So what's the drawback to this line? Why doesn't everyone just play h5? Well, the drawback is now, of course, one day, if you castle kingside, you know, you have pushed a big pawn like in front of your king, right? Big no-no, like breaking this rule. So long story short, in the future, it's going to be risky to castle kingside. But I think the practical benefits kind of outweigh the disadvantages, because your opponent is not going to know what to do. And you don't have to castle. I mean, the center has not been opened yet, right? So you can play rook c8, you can play bishop e7, knight b6, b4. You can make a lot of moves on the queen side before ever having to touch your king. And then once you have a lot of counterplay, the right moment you castle and you get the other rook into the game, you basically have a really nice position. So, I mean, of course, it's not like black is better. What a lot of players try is like bishop d3, maybe even rook e1, but this isn't the usual play that they're looking for in the English attack, which is why I think this is kind of an interesting choice. And keep in mind, remember, if white is playing f4 in this position, keep in mind of the drawback, right? Pawn on e4 is going to be weak, and this move b4 could just win you the e4 pawn outright. So white has to be very, very careful before pushing f4 and weakening the e4 pawn. So watch out for this one. Another move to watch out for, just for all Najdorf players, if white ever leaves the c3 knight unprotected, let's say queen f2, I would say just close your eyes and just take it. If white's king is castled queenside and you can take and double the pawns, just do it. Just do it. Queen can come out to e5, you can bring your knight to a4. These weaknesses are just going to be disastrous for white. One day you'll get your second rook to the c-file, and it's pretty bad. Yeah, same thing with the dragon and many other Sicilian positions. If white is castled queenside and queens are still on the board and you can sack and double their pawns, just do it. I don't care what the engine says, just do it. Actually, there's a very famous game, I'm sure Sicilian players have are familiar with this one, Movsesian versus Kasparov, which has kind of like a funny story behind it that you can Google. But basically, Kasparov just like took on c3 and just absolutely crushed the guy. Really, really nice game. One of the best Najdorf games of all time. Okay, guys, that's going to wrap it up for the opening lab. Once again, we do this monthly for some of our patrons at the $15 tier. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys again for next month. I'm going to be taking a quick break here for the stream. We have a rapid match coming up. And I'm going to be going on break here in a sec and setting that up. So coming up, guys, we have a very special rapid match between Pawn Grubber and Chess Gains. We had this match on Monday, and now it's going to be another match. So I'm going to go on break here and set that up, and hopefully see you guys in something like maybe, let's say, 10 minutes or so. All right, guys, have a good one, and catch you next time.